Welcome back to the Agent Survival Guide podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Ruppel, and we are back with another 5 Things edition of our Friday 5. We are talking all things Spotify Wrapped, going over some stats from our podcast version of Spotify Wrapped, and of course, adding in a few of my personal stats in here for fun. But before we get to the treat that this episode is meant to be, I just want to say congratulations on wrapping up another annual enrollment period. We've made it to the end of another one. We have survived, so congratulations on that front. And a quick reminder, if you're selling ACA plans right now, the ACA open enrollment period is still going on, but in most states, December 15th is the cutoff to get applications in for a January 1 effective date. Exceptions to that rule would be Massachusetts and Missouri, with a cutoff of December 23rd for coverage starting January 1. And then Nevada and New Jersey allow applications to be taken up until December 31st for a January 1 effective date. We'll be linking to the list of states and their dates and cutoffs in our notes, just in case you need a reminder of what the rules are in your state, especially as we're winding down OEP and those last-minute calls start coming in. But for now, let's get into this week's episode, because we're going to have a little bit of fun before we get into the more serious work of post-AEP planning. That episode is coming, but not until tomorrow. Today is all about Spotify Wrapped and all of the episodes and things you have loved about the Agent Survival Guide podcast this year. And I should probably mention, for those who might not be familiar, Spotify tracks listening from January through a date a few weeks before the launch of Wrapped. It then takes your listening from that time frame and packages it very nicely into a little slideshow. And if you've got a podcast on Spotify, you get a Spotify Wrapped for the podcast, which is pretty cool. But 2 big things I do want to say before we get into those numbers. Because of the way Spotify takes in data for Wrapped, it doesn't count all the episodes that we put out during the year. And then also keep in mind, this is not a total picture of the listeners of this podcast. There are a lot of ways to listen to the ASG podcast. And fun fact, for most of our listeners, that actually takes place on Apple Podcasts rather than Spotify. But our audience has been steadily growing on Spotify. And again, this is meant to be a really fun snapshot to share, along with some of my own personal Spotify Wrapped results. So first up, let's talk about some of the stats that would not be possible without your listening habits. Our podcast saw a 24% increase in listeners, a 44% increase in streams, and a 31% increase in followers, which is pretty amazing, and it's all thanks to you. So thank you for that. We appreciate your support of the show so much. It's what makes numbers like that possible. Next thing that I want to mention, our most shared episode of the podcast on Spotify this year, my interview with Ben Miller from Zing Health on understanding the CSNP product and opportunity. That was a great conversation that led to some other interview opportunities, and we are really excited about the prospect of getting even more interviews out on the feed in 2024. And then, of course, another great stat from our Spotify Wrapped. It identifies our top episode of the year on the streaming platform. And this year, that honor goes to the future of Medicare Part D, the push toward MAPD. Quick background on this episode. It was adapted from a blog post written by our CEO, Craig Ritter. The episode was streamed 415% more than an average episode, which tells me that we should definitely have Craig come in for an official interview here on the podcast. Getting into some fun metrics from our list. The top podcast genres of our listeners were business, comedy, and education, in that order. That tracks pretty well with the type of content we try to put out here. Business-related, educational content, and we do try to have fun while we're doing it. So those are our official podcast Spotify Wrapped stats. I thought I'd also share a few of the more interesting tidbits from my own Spotify Wrapped. I've been holding off on posting about it on social, so these are exclusive takes here. First things first, for someone who mainly listens to podcasts on Spotify, I feel like there's a lot more that Spotify could tell me about my podcast listening, more than just the minutes I've spent listening during the year and the top 5 podcasts that I listen to. But that's also coming from someone who listens to a whole lot of podcasts. And I don't think that's the typical Spotify user experience. To put that in perspective, I listened to Spotify for 68,425 minutes in 2023. Which put me in the top 3% of listeners. 53,462 of those minutes were podcast listening minutes, making up 78% of my total listening. And of course, coming in at number 1 for my podcast listening this year, Nothing Much Happens, the sleep and relaxation podcast hosted by Catherine Nicolai, with audio editing by Bob Wittersheim. When it comes to music listening on Spotify, that's pretty much made up of what my daughter and I listen to in the car. And she likes playing DJ these days, so she's the one picking and playing the songs we listen to. It is a lot of Taylor Swift at the moment. And because of that, my genre sandwich is definitely skewed towards her preferences. Coming in at number 1, pop. Number 2, movie tunes. And then in third, Otacore. If you're not familiar with that genre, it is heavily influenced by Japanese anime. The word is a portmanteau of otaku, which is Japanese for geek, and then the core comes from hardcore. So J-pop falls into this category. And I've also seen the genre described generally as just heavy, happy, and uplifting. But I can't say that I could place a specific song that we listen to in that category. So take that for what it's worth. Our sound town ended up being Canberra, Australia, with Bliss and Esso being highlighted in addition to music from the Zombies movies on Disney. And then last but not least, and also not surprising to me, according to my Spotify Wrapped, I'm a collector because my taste is sublime, which noted, and because I listen to my own playlists. Now, we move music in and out of a handful of playlists throughout the year. This was something I thought would help keep my music and my daughter's music organized and separated, and it does help on that front. But it also means that Spotify DJ gets very confused and has no idea what to play for us. Eventually, she'll get her own Spotify account, but we're not quite there yet. Things will get really interesting when that happens. But for now, that is a wrap on Spotify Wrapped in 2023. I'll be posting some of those fun graphics on Instagram and Threads. So if you follow along with me, please add in your own stats and graphics. Leave a comment on there, and we'll give you a shout out on the show next week. Until then, have a great weekend. Stay healthy and stay safe out there. And we will see you next week. The Agent Survival Guide podcast is a production of Ritter Insurance Marketing, an integrity company. This episode was written and produced by me, Sarah Ruppel. Script editing and fact check by Tina Lamoureux. Podcast design by Urban Rivera. Artwork by Vivian Zhao. Follow along with us wherever you like to listen.